بكم جميعا وحياكم الله. Good evening, good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. And thank you so much for being here. My name is Abdullah Hamid al-Din. I'm the director of the Yemen program at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies. And it's a great privilege to have with us today Professor Mark Katz from the United States and Adam Barron. Where are you now, Adam? From Egypt.
I'm currently in Cairo.
Currently in Cairo. And also with us is my colleague, Aya El-Garni. She's a researcher at the Center with the Yemen program. And we also have with us a translator. So if anyone needs, okay, بالعربي I guess. للترجمة اللي يحتاج يعني إذا كان هناك حاجة للترجمة فضلا اختيار اللغة العربية. في أسفل الشاشة هناك أيقونة تشبه الكرة الأرضية، اضغطوا عليها واختار Arabic للعربي. حديثنا اليوم سيكون, or our discussion today will be on Yemen. Sorry, this bilingual switch is sometimes confusing. So we will be talking today about the implications of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine on Yemen. Yemen is already a very complicated or in a very complicated situation, and it's also quite confusing to analyze. And the situation, humanitarian, is deteriorating, year after year. The military escalation is still going on internally, and also with cross-border missile attacks, such as the ones that happened a few days ago on Saudi Arabia. And it seems there doesn't seem to be any opportunity for a political way out now. There is in the next week there are going to be some consultations between Yemeni actors in Riyadh, so hopefully that will open a window of opportunity for the country. But today's discussion is not going to focus on Yemen's inner dynamics, rather on some of the global dynamics that influence Yemen. And they have been many. Some of them have, such as the nuclear deal between Iran and the United States and other countries. I mean, that has been a point of focus on how that will, how that will influence the situation on Yemen. There have been some minor discussions on the implications of Chinese, U.S. competition, Russian-U.S. competition, and so but it hasn't taken, or it wasn't considered, except the nuclear deal. Other global implications have been minimal, or at least they haven't had a significant visible impact. But now, since the Russian invasion on Ukraine, we've already heard and seen some of the some analysts talking about the implications of that conflict on the greater Middle East, as well as on Yemen. Most of the discussion has been on humanitarian or food security issues, but then there are other issues which I'm sure Professor Mark and Adam will discuss. To speak briefly about our speakers today, Professor Mark is Mark Katz is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University. He has, his knowledge, experience, and expertise on the region and its relationship to Russia, previously the Soviet Union, spans many decades. One of his books, published in 1986, was about Russia and Arabia, Soviet foreign policy towards the Arabian Peninsula. And he was also a visiting research fellow at the center in 2001, so much before I was at the center, and hopefully we can see him soon again. Adam is a writer, a consultant, and a political analyst, and his focus is on the Middle East with an emphasis on Yemen and the Gulf. And Both of them will be speaking for about 10-15 minutes each about the topic from different angles, and then we will, Ayal and I will have a discussion with them, and then we'll open it to the floor. If you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box, and I'll hopefully get to them, and we can take it informally. If Professor Mark or Adam sees a question and they want to jump into it, we can just do that. So with that, thank you once more. Thank you, Professor Mark. Thank you, Adam, and let's begin. Professor Mark first. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so very much. It's a great honor to be here with the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies. Produces a lot of very interesting research, and it's always good to be with this particular group. Now, with what we've seen, obviously, is that the conflict in Yemen has been ongoing for several years now, and the conflict with Ukraine also really, started in 2014 in terms of the Russian annexation of Crimea, movement into eastern Ukraine, but now we have a full-scale war there. And I guess just to start, what I'd like to, and of course there's also the conflict in Syria, that the Russian approach to the conflict in Yemen has been very different than its approach to the conflict in Syria. In Syria, Russia is working closely with Iran and its Hezbollah allies in support of the Assad regime. In other words, it has a very clear set of allies in Syria. In Yemen, though, Russia's approach has been quite different, that Russia is not a party to the conflict. And even though some might think that they would side with their Iranian friends in Yemen just as much as in Syria, this has not been the case. That in Yemen, essentially, Russia has sought to have good relations with all three major regional external actors, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Iran, plus several of the major internal actors as well. The Russians recognize the government of President Hadi, and they received him on several occasions. They have worked with the Southern independence movement as well. In other words, the forces that have been supported by the UAE. And they have surprisingly good relations with the Houthis. What was interesting was that after the Houthis seized Sana'a and most countries removed their embassies from there, the Russians kept theirs open all the way into December 2017. And only removed it after the death of President Saleh, who of course was really their favorite actor in Yemen. They had worked with him, of course, for decades. And essentially, I think President Saleh was very much like Putin in the sense that he prided himself on his maneuverability, sort of switching alliances back and forth. He had been against the Houthis and with the Houthis, and appeared to be turning against the Houthis again when he was killed. But he maintained good relations with Russia, and of course they had lots of contacts among them. And so we have this, sort of this hedging policy that Moscow has pursued in Yemen. And I think that the war in Ukraine has not changed this. In fact, if anything, it's made it more important for Moscow than ever to maintain good relations with the three external actors, especially Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. That the Russians are very much counting on them to stick with the OPEC plus agreement and not to increase oil production too much. In other words, that Russia was having a hard time selling oil. It very much benefits from higher oil prices than what could happen. As we saw in 2020 when Saudi Arabia opened the taps in a pricing dispute with Russia. So they don't want to see this happen again. So they don't seem to want to be. They're not going to move against Saudi or UAE interests here. On the other hand, they also need to keep good relations with Iran. And in fact, if anything, maybe they're even somewhat less concerned about that because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have choices. They can work with the West, they can work with the Russians, the Chinese, whereas Iran has fewer choices, is more dependent. And so what we saw recently in the JCPOA negotiations in Vienna, that the Russians advanced the demand that when it comes to the sanctions relief that the JCPOA anticipates with regard to Iran, that Russia wanted to make sure that Ukraine-related sanctions did not apply to Russia's trade with Iran. And what was fascinating was that after a meeting with the Iranian foreign minister, the Russians actually backed down from this, that no, they were just wanted to make sure that they could fulfill their responsibilities with regard to Iranian uranium supplies and taking spent fuel. So what's fascinating is that the Russians seem to be in a difficult situation. Now, what I think is also interesting about their policy toward Yemen now is that this is not new. In other words, that Moscow has engaged in hedging behavior with regard to Yemen in the past. In fact, certainly since the from 1967, from the emergence of an independent South Yemen up until 1990, the Yemeni unification, what we saw was that while Moscow basically had a strong relationship with Marxist South Yemen, which was at odds with North Yemen, that Moscow did its level best to have good relations with North Yemen as well. In other words, that Moscow balanced between North and South Yemen during this period. And sort of and especially remarkable was the period 1978 to 1982, when South Yemen was supporting this Marxist National Democratic Front insurgency in North Yemen, which obviously the South was receiving Soviet support. But also, amazingly, the Soviets were actually giving military assistance to North Yemen in suppressing this insurgency at exactly the same time. And we even know that Soviet pilots were flying helicopters, sort of ferrying North Yemeni troops in and around the place, much to the annoyance of Aden. But of course, they didn't have many choices. They couldn't exactly break with the Russians at this time. So they engaged at this time as well. We also saw between 1982 and 1986, the period in which Ali Nasser had been able to overcome his adversary, Abdel Fattah Ismail, who went into exile in Moscow. Well, the Russians kept him and they sent him back in 1985. It was believed that maybe the Russians feared that Ali Nasser was becoming too independent, so they wanted to have a check on his behavior. And of course, this ended in the disaster of the 1986 South Yemeni civil war. So we've seen this kind of hedging behavior before with Moscow exercises toward Yemen, and I suspect that we will see this now. Now, of course, there's always the threat. The potential threat doesn't have to actually be articulated, that if anyone does anything that Moscow doesn't like, then perhaps Moscow can do something to aid the other side or some other side in Yemen. But I think that we have in terms of Moscow's priorities right now, Ukraine is the most important priority, probably even far greater than Syria. But Syria is a greater priority than Yemen. So Yemen is pretty far down the list at the moment. So the question is, will it stay that way or not? Now, Dr. Abdullah mentioned the humanitarian aspect, and it's important to mention this as well. Yemen, like many Middle Eastern countries, receives its wheat imports primarily from southern Russia and Ukraine. And what we've seen, of course, is that Ukrainian exports have just ended And Russia, I believe, has suspended its wheat exports. And there's also just trouble with shipping. In other words, you can't get insurance for shipping in the Black Sea at any reasonable cost. And so what we've seen is that Russian wheat exports, Ukrainian wheat exports have essentially dried up. And this is going to affect Middle Eastern importers. And of course, the trouble with wheat is not like other products where you can start manufacturing the next day. There's only so much available in the around the world at any one point, and obviously we've seen grain prices rise, and this is obviously going to have a terrible impact on Yemen. And it's even those parties who might wish to help Yemen out, the fact of the matter is that there's just not that much grain available, and it appears that there will not be Ukrainian. In other words, that there will not be Ukrainians will not be planting wheat this season. In other words, that crop is going to be lost so long as this war continues. So this is a terrible impact, and it will not make things easier. And of course, Russia is not exactly in a position to do much of anything about this, but it's going to be the Yemen and the neighboring countries that feel the brunt of this. So I guess the question then is, in terms of if Yemen has sort of fallen down the list of Russian priorities as a result of the war in Ukraine, then presumably things can't change until things change in Ukraine. And there appear to really be just three possibilities. One is that this war, which President Putin appeared to believe was going to be just over and done in a couple of days, would be like the war with Georgia in 2008, that Russian forces would overwhelm the opposition, that Ukrainian forces would even defect to the Russians, because after all, in Putin's view, they really are Russian and they must feel themselves to be such. He didn't even prepare his own population for a conflict. He was so overconfident. Well, if the war grinds on, it seems to me that that Russia's ability to operate elsewhere is going to be limited. I think a lot of the analysis is that, with Russia involved in Ukraine, clearly it's expanding its influence everywhere, including the Middle East. I argue that that Russia may not be able to operate very effectively in the Middle East so long as this conflict is continuing. Now, it's very different, the fact that there are governments in the Middle East who have adopted positions that certainly the West is not happy with, but what I think is important to understand is that governments are pursuing what they perceive as their own interests. In other words, that decisions that the U.S. might not like are not made because governments are pro-Russian. They're pursuing their own particular interests. So I think that so long as the war continues, we won't see that great a Russian emphasis on the Middle East. But of course, the war could end, and it seems that it could end in one of two ways. I mean, one is that simply that whatever setbacks Russia is experiencing now, it will slowly but surely overcome just by the weight of numbers. There's sort of indications, certainly in today's Washington Post, that that just slowly but surely that the Russians are gaining ground. That's a possibility. And of course, once that happens, still, sort of the occupation of Ukraine is obviously not going to be very easy, but this will make it easier for the Russians to do things in the Middle East and elsewhere. The other possibility is that the war will end in catastrophe for the Russians, that it's a question of, up until now, up until this conflict, Putin has been highly successful in how he's used force, whether in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Ukraine in 2014, in Syria. In other words, that there's sort of been this image of Putin as being, the super Machiavellian who's anticipated everything and managed to come out ahead. this time is different, and this could, in fact, if things go badly, the more things go badly in Ukraine, the more other problems are likely to pop up. It would not, certainly that control over the armed forces is not a foregone conclusion. Certainly we saw in World War I, in other words, that in 1917, the Tsarist army simply collapsed under the weight of the ongoing conflict with Germany. That is a real possibility, it seems to me. That there's also, I think, the possibility that the security services are not happy, and they basically want this to end, and that they need to be able to start exporting oil, gas, wheat, everything else, and that if Putin is the obstacle, then they'll get rid of him. In which case, I think we would see in other words, that the current Russian policy is very much dependent on the current Russian leadership. What we've seen with Russia is that when one leader replaces another, there's usually drastic policy changes. Not in everything, but in many things. That one leader completely changes policy. Those that have been followed by the one who was in office. And so I think that is, in other words, if there is a leadership change in Russia, I think we'll see a policy change as well there. Also, I think what's important to mention is that just as Yemen isn't the highest priority for Russia, it's not the highest priority for America and the West. In other words, just as it has always been really ever since the 1960s, it's really more the regional great powers who are more involved in the affairs of Yemen, and who simply have much better knowledge of what is going on. And of course, they're motivated, especially Saudi Arabia, in that it's right next door to Yemen, to be involved there. And so I think that that this is, in other words, that Yemen is just going to be something of a sideshow for Russia, for the United States, especially as long as this conflict continues. Well, why don't I stop there? I think I've said enough, and turn it back to you, Dr.
No, well, thank you so much. And I had a couple of questions. So, if my understanding, to summarize what you said in a couple of points or a couple of key takeaways, is one is Russia's approach to the region is based on hedging, or at least balancing between different actors who might be adversarial to each other in certain ways, or like Iran, Yemen, North, South, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the region. And so that's one side. And on the other hand, it's a low priority. So what you're essentially saying is that the current conflict doesn't have a political impact on, a direct political impact on Yemen, while it might have a humanitarian or food security impact. And I wanted to come back on the first point, if my understanding was correct, but maybe after Adam speaks, but I'll just mention it quickly. Some of the indirect impacts. For example, the value of Iran to Russia, how much will it increase due to this conflict? And then what kind of the indirect impact will that be on Iran's capacity to sort of expand or at least play more in the region, in tandem with the most likely coming JCPOA, and then how that will impact its alliance with the Houthis in Yemen and so on. But if we can talk about this more after Adam's remarks. And Adam, please go ahead. And Yael, please feel free to just pitch in whenever you have a remark.
Sure. So I guess to jump in with Mark, I'm going to be looking at things more from a Yemen-focused perspective rather than a wider regional one. And part of these are observations that have actually come from being in Yemen for the bulk of the past month. Mostly in Aden. I just got out of Yemen Monday. First, there's obviously the political elements. For Yemen, this war puts them in quite a different place in the sense that it's basically forcing, I mean, they've largely stayed out of directly choosing sides because it's basically putting them in a position where they're having to choose between one of two very powerful P5 countries. You have seen, however, certain Yemeni figures take very prominent stances, most notably figures affiliated to the Houthis, who have long seen the Russians as a potential ally, have taken public stances in support of Russia, including offering their recognition of the breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine to the extent that they can offer recognition. In addition to that, you've also seen the STC, certain, or at least certain figures within the STC, albeit unofficially, make gestures of support to Russia as well. You saw this pop up in a recent pro-STC protest in Shabwa, where there were photos of STC leader President Idris Zubaydi next to Vladimir Putin. Also, just anecdotally, in southern networks in Aden, I had numerous people telling me, who were old school socialists dating back when, the pre-1990 period, who are voicing support for Russia based off of that. Walking down the street in Crater with some colleagues, and we had Kulna Putin loudly yelled at us by a group of onlookers who I think assumed that we were Russian because we were white and walking down the street in Aden, which oddly paralleled a similar experience I had when I was in Sana'a, when I was also congratulated by a cab driver on my people's takeover of Crimea. I didn't let the guy know that my grandparents were Ukrainian because it would have made things a bit awkward. Beyond that, there's also, as Professor Mark alluded to, it's going to take away not just Russia's attention on Yemen, it's going to take away the international community's attention on Yemen. When sitting in Aden, conversations regarding the war in Ukraine far outnumbered conversations regarding the special envoy's consultations in Amman. You did see a bit of a shift with the announcement of the GCC consultations, which are upcoming in Riyadh. That was obviously a subject of a lot of discussion in Yemen, just due to if nothing else, just due to the sheer newness of the GCC taking a renewed role in Yemen for the first time since, at least to this extent, for the first time since the GCC initiative of 2011. Of course, you also have Yemen playing a potential role in terms of the ongoing negotiations between the British and United States government and key Gulf actors, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There's a perception in some media reports that there's going to be some sort of concession from either the US or the UK on key aspects to the Yemen file in order to convince, how would you put this, to convince an increase in production. It remains to be seen whether or not this is media speculation, but it does speak to the extent that the war in Ukraine has really served to take over so much of the narrative about even tangentially unrelated files. Of course, the largest and most direct influence the war is going to have on Yemen is going to be economic. Along with the rest of the world, Yemen is going to experience a sharp uptick in the price of oil derivatives and prices, particularly of wheat and things like flour. This is going to have massive humanitarian, quality of life, governance, and potentially even political consequences. And I think you were already seeing, when I was in Yemen, you were already seeing some of the fruits of this start to happen. So first, humanitarian. Obviously, 7 years of conflict has exacerbated Yemen's already fragile economy. You've had an uptick in poverty rates and particularly food insecurity. The increases in the cost of food and fuel will push even more Yemenis to the brink of hunger, particularly since you're having the price of bread directly affected by these flour price increases. You've already heard sort of rumors about increases in the price of wheat across Yemen, both in areas under government control and areas under Houthi control. Second, you're talking about quality of life changes. You've already had increases in petrol lines in Aden and Sana'a. Driving around the last week or so when I was in Aden, you would see massive petrol lines. Our driver would allude to it. There's a perception that this, although, petrol lines are not the most out of the ordinary thing in Yemen these days, there was a perception that this was related to supply shocks coming from the Ukraine conflict. In addition to this, you're looking at an increase potentially in power cuts in areas like Aden and Mukalla, just as the summer heat is coming. This is already a massive issue, and this is something that often has political and humanitarian implications on its own. Obviously, in a city like Aden or a city like Aden or Mukalla, where heat is so high, a lack of access to things like air conditioning quite literally is causing massive public health issues. Third, there's a question of governance. Challenges related to electricity provision already take up a significant amount of the time of key local authorities, particularly in Aden, where electricity costs are eating up a significant portion of the government's budget. Rising costs will exacerbate both issues, diminishing national and government level authorities' capacity to deal with other important issues. Simultaneously, Yemen's capacity to export oil and liquefied natural gas has yet to truly recover from the fallout of the conflict, meaning that in a lot of ways, they're not going to be able to reap the benefits of the increase in oil derivative prices, the way they would have if we're talking about this being before the war, before 2014. Finally, you have the political implications of these economic implications. You have this risk that rising frustrations will spiral into protests. Spontaneous demonstrations, which tend to involve roadblocks, are already quite destabilizing. But also you're looking at tensions between different political factions on the ground. So this popular anger also represents an opportunity for different actors to try to shift dynamics in their favor. If you're sitting in a city not losing access to electricity, particularly in the summer heat, you're not really caring about whether this is due to some conflict far away. It's something where it's quite an opportunity for those that are seeking to reap the benefits or shift power in their favor to point the finger and say, look, this is because this power that's in this political faction that's in power isn't doing enough. Excuse me. And you're already seeing what a friend of mine in Hadramaut calls the protest season starting amid popular mobilization efforts targeting officials in parts of Yemen. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing the questions.
No, thank you. I think this gave us a brief complementary brief between the international and the, an international outlook and then an outlook from Yemen, although it's quite bleak. And so maybe my immediate question, but I'll go back first to Professor Mark. But my question to you, Adam, if you could think of it for a second, is: do you think it will change the political positions of actors inside? Will it increase the threshold of pain to the point where a serious quest for a solution becomes more viable than we currently have? But before you answer, if I can go back quickly to Professor Mark on the questions I asked in the beginning, after your discussion, is do you see any indirect effects, such as I mentioned, regarding Russia's? If Russia, the priority for Russia is definitely going to be, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other Gulf countries. So it's, I don't think it will intervene in a way that jeopardizes their interests, even if it's, if it has, if its competition with the US might push some people to think that Russia would do that, especially some of the people inside Yemen, some of the Houthi actors, are imagining that maybe this US-Russian competition would lead to Russia siding that, with all US enemies and so on. But indirectly, would it benefit Iran in a way that it would benefit its regional allies and proxies, or do you think that kind of indirect analysis or view is a stretch?
It's interesting. I just think that, the Iranians, I really don't think that they actually have, in other words, how big an attraction for Iran is there? In other words, obviously you have, they're siding with fellow Shias, but they're different kinds of Shias. The trouble with Yemen is that Yemeni actors are never loyal to their external patrons, it seems to me. And I just think that Iran's focus is more on Iraq and Syria. That's what they're really interested in, and Lebanon. Yemen, it's useful to cause problems for Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That's what they liked about Yemen. But Yemen would do that anyway, it seems to me. And I think, and Iran can't alleviate the problems that Adam was describing, nor can Russia. That's the thing. In other words, that neither Iran nor Russia is in a position to make things better. And I think that, whatever protests there are in the south or wherever about the conditions, in other words, that if the Houthis came down there, it wouldn't be any different. In other words, they're not bringing electricity with them. They're not bringing wheat with them. And that seems to have, certainly since my visits to Yemen, I mean, the problem is that no one seems to be able to satisfy the pent-up demands of this impoverished population. It's just, it's just ongoing. It just can't be easily taken care of. So I think that, if Iran's ambitions in Yemen are greater, in other words, to finally, okay, we can sort of, let's have an allied government, like the Assad government or something like this, it's going to be very difficult. And also just that, as we've seen before with the Yemeni actors, they won't necessarily remain loyal if they can get a better deal elsewhere. So I'm not sure that's a very good answer to your question, but that's all the answer I can come up with at present.
Actually, it is. So what you're saying is, even if Iran benefits directly from this conflict, it doesn't necessarily have a spillover effect on Yemen the way some people might imagine. And Adam, just another question before we see if we have any Q&A, and if Ayal has any questions as well. On the whether this humanitarian situation, this deterioration, which might, and the food insecurity, which is now going to be compounded by this conflict. If you think it's, I mean, from your discussions inside Yemen, I mean, was there any mention of maybe we need to finish this off so that we can avoid any more negative impacts or suffering? And the other thing is, when you mentioned international attention, there is a lack of attention, but do you think that it might also lead people to focus more on ending the conflict as a way of focusing on the bigger issues, or will it just be sidelined while everyone is focusing on Russia and Ukraine?
I mean, my answers are going to sound extremely pessimistic, perhaps, but one, I think effectively, yes, this means that you're going to have potentially I think one, Yemen is going to be sidelined, and then two, it's also risking greater politicization or divides on Yemen at the Security Council. I'm not necessarily saying that's going to happen, but there's a potential that it could happen. And I think the risk of Yemen being sidelined is perhaps one of the reasons why it's such a positive step, I guess, that the GCC is taking the initiative to host this Yemen conference in Riyadh, because I've been thinking in the back of my head how things would have moved forward if this conference was not being held. Yemen really would have been completely on the back burner to some extent, at least overshadowed, was it not for this. That being said, I mean, I think by and large, people on the ground have come to peace with the fact that Yemen is effectively trapped in what will likely be an extended war of attrition. And I think Ukraine doesn't change that. Developments in different parts of the world don't necessarily change that. It's fundamentally set on the fact that both, the Houthis think that they're in a very good position where they can continue. They feel like they're winning the war. They feel like they can continue. And then on the other hand, the government and the SDC and other anti-Houthi groups feel like it's unacceptable to leave the Houthis in the position where they're as strong as they are, and feel like they still have time on their side to push back. This is an essential thing, I guess, kind of rooted in the situation as it stands on the ground. And as depressing as this may sound, it's hard to imagine anything shifting these essential calculations as they stand at the moment. So that's my wider answer on whether this will potentially shift people's mindsets towards some sort of resolution of the conflict. I think you do have a situation where people still are very much. I'm not saying that there aren't elements, different groups in the conflict. The government is always stating that they're very welcoming with regards to peace talks, etc. But I still think what it comes down to is the positions of all of the key sides in Yemen remain too far apart from each other. And unless that shifts, I don't think you're going to have real movement on the peace process, unfortunately.
Okay, could you elaborate on the issue? You mentioned something related to the Security Council. I mean, based on what Professor Mark was saying, while there might be tension between Russia and the other, 4 permanent members and maybe other members in the Security Council, as Professor Mark was saying, or what I understood from him, is that Russia will still take into account the GCC's priorities. So what kind of impact did you mean within the Security Council on with regards to Yemen?
Particularly compared to other more contentious files in the region, Syria being chief among them, you have had relative unanimity on the P5 within the Security Council. That being said, sometimes when there's tensions between certain Security Council members, particularly within the P5, these tensions can emerge in other places. We haven't necessarily seen that yet, but I guess you have seen that actually in other, if you look at the way the JCPOA has kind of been risked being derailed due to US-Russia tensions, for example, there is that potential that the tensions between the US and the UK and Russia could really potentially spiral onto other venues, so to speak.
Again, I'm going to push this, but the last UN resolution was, there was a consensus in it. I mean, and so.
If I could just jump in, I mean, I think that the Russian.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not saying it's happened yet.
The Russians compartmentalized their diplomacy. In other words, that disagreement in one area doesn't necessarily carry over to another. In other words, that they pride themselves on being able to cooperate in some areas, even as they're competing in others. So I would think that in other words, things would have to be really different or really get even worse than they are now. Oh, God forbid. But I think that, in other words, that the trajectory of Russian diplomacy would be to continue the cooperative effort, and partly because they want to show that they're a responsible power. In other words, what they're doing in Ukraine is right and just, and they're just behaving responsibly everywhere else as well. So I think that they would continue this approach when it comes to Yemen in the Security Council, and also with UAE a member at the moment. I think they're going to coordinate with it in particular.
Yeah, I would think so. But Adam, you were saying something before your voice cut off.
Oh, no, sorry about that. No, I was going to actually bring up the Russia-UAE cooperation and saying that also adds a really interesting dynamic to the Security Council, especially since you're seeing, at least from the Russian standpoint, I think the UAE has become, I mean, there's always been an alliance there, but I think the UAE has become much more of an important ally since this war started, and particularly the sanctions for Russia. So that also adds a really interesting dynamic to Security Council, to the Security Council deliberations, particularly on Yemen moving forward.
I think I'll just ask one final question and then we'll go to the Q&A and maybe someone wants to intervene. You mentioned sanctions and we didn't bring it up. Will the sanctions impact Yemen's ability to, I mean, you know, how much would it impact Yemen's current ability to trade with other countries that might be sanctioned by, or other entities that are going to be sanctioned because of the sanction regime on Russia? I mean, maybe it's not clear yet, but do you have any idea, both of you, you know, Professor Mark and Adam?
Well, you know, everyone faces this problem, obviously. You know, it's, you know, I don't think that Yemen is in a position to be making major purchases from a lot of places. So, and I think that, you know, if they need to, they'll evade sanctions. I don't think that this is going to be the most troublesome thing. I think the real question is, you know, will they get assistance? In other words, will countries that have resources be able to alleviate Yemen's crises? And Russia and Iran are not such countries. In other words, they're not in a position to do so. It's going to have to be, you know, the GCC countries or the West or China. And I'm not sure any of them, their willingness or ability to do so, but it's the two countries that are not going to be able to be helpful in this regard are Russia and Iran.
So, I mean, some of the questions overlap, maybe you've already answered them. I mean, one of them from Professor Paul Sullivan about the impact on food security. And I think, Adam, you've answered that. If either of you, you know, if you have any anything to add. But there was a question on oil derivatives. He was saying, do you mean oil refined products? I don't think there is a financial derivatives market in Yemen. So
yeah, I just misspoke. Sorry about that.
Okay, so yeah. And then he was pointing to some of the health ramifications of electricity or lack of it. He's saying if it's lost, will it lead to cholera coming back? And that might be an interesting, a scary thing to think about, not just the food insecurity, but all the energy unavailability, but also maybe some of the health risks associated with it. I don't know, Adam, I mean, you know, from you, it's only been 1 month, so hopefully it doesn't last longer, but do you see the health sector, it's already broken, but do you see it even being further strained by this?
I mean, if you're looking at higher prices of oil and gas, especially considering a lot of hospitals are heavily reliant on generator power. Yes, that does have health-related consequences. So it certainly doesn't bode positively. I mean, I'm based in Beirut, so I'm quite familiar with kind of the ways that this can kind of manifest itself. You know, so it's not even, when you think of that, you know, it's not even stuff like cholera. It's sort of, you know, if you lack access to refrigeration, that means things like food poisoning. That means, which can be quite severe if it's a severe case, and particularly, so you're really having all sorts of potential increasing issues related to health. Elderly people, when, you know, in extremely hot summer weather, and let's face it, southern Yemen is one of the hottest places on earth. You know, even some of the more quotidian things can really be quite severe.
Yeah, do you have anything?
Yes, thank you both for your great remarks. I was just thinking, you know, as you've described, we're expecting, unfortunately, further destabilization within Yemen in terms of food security and tensions between different groups due to the impact of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. Does this mean there's two options in my mind? Does this mean there will be more aggression, more attacks, for example, on Saudi, and like essentially more aggression, or would that mean certain parties are willing to cooperate and compensate and maybe accommodate and come to an agreement due to the severity of the conflict?
I mean, I think there's a case to be made that the recent uptake in cross-border attacks coming from the Houthis at Saudi is not just a message about the war in Yemen. It's also a message regarding the wider international oil market. They're saying the message is not just them saying we can hit Saudi Arabia. The message is them saying we can disrupt the entire global oil market at a time of extreme at a time of already existing extreme disruption. So it's almost messaging from the Houthis saying, trying to project power in that sense,
right.
Trying to project themselves as an actor that is not just relevant, on the Yemen, with regards to Yemen, but quite relevant even in terms of, the global energy market, which is, when you think about it, it's a pretty intense message.
Right. So do you still think that, the conflict in Yemen will be sidelined, and, if further attacks like this take place and more attention is given or brought to the region and to the conflict in Yemen?
I mean, it remains to be seen. If you have some sort of massive civilian casualty incident from one of these attacks, it would shift things. But I think, at least for the moment, the conflict in Ukraine is really sidelining pretty much everything. It will be interesting to see how. I mean, you are getting more diplomatic attention, particularly from, I would say, Western US, UK diplomats being paid to these attacks because of how they're intersecting with the energy market in terms of the current situation being brought on by the war in Ukraine. But I really think it's kind of an open question moving forward.
If I could just add something as well, these Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I mean, it's possible that the Iranians applaud these, but the Russians don't. These are not in Russia's interests at all, because obviously Russia wants to, in other words, wants to maintain its cooperation, its much more profitable cooperation with both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So the Russian approach, I think, to Yemen is to keeping a balance. And what they don't want is to see the balance, get out of balance. And they don't want to see that war get widened. In other words, the wider that it becomes, the less influence Russia can possibly have. And I think that it's not in their interest. When Dr. Abdullah said, the Houthis have offered to recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. This reminds me how in 2008, this is exactly what Hezbollah did with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And of course, the Russians they're happy about that, but it's not like they need this. It's that the Houthi recognition. In other words, in that the Houthis are generally reviled, Houthi recognition of these two republics doesn't really do Russia a lot of good. That's not who they need to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk. So I think that the Houthis, in a certain sense, are their behavior is in fact somewhat embarrassing to Moscow, but Moscow's obviously not in a position to control them. But they're not going to help them that much either.
Yeah, well, we have about 5 minutes. Someone in the audience is raising his hand, but if you can write your question, إذا ممكن تكتب السؤال في الشات. إنه الأسئلة بالشات يعني ما في مشاركات صوتية. So most of the questions here, do you think, the Russian conflict is, some of the last questions I'm reading from the bottom up, isn't going to affect the relationships between Gulf and Russia when it comes to Yemen. I think, Professor Mark, you've already answered that, from the beginning. And if you want to say anything extra, and then possible political economic gains inside Yemen that Houthis would possibly pursue, same for STC. So this might be an interesting one to Adam, and maybe also to you, Professor Mark, is which is more, it seems to be more about how they would leverage, how would the internal actors inside Yemen leverage or benefit or try to benefit from the crisis or from the impacts to their own political ends. Do you think there is a window for that, or as things get worse, do they benefit the various militarized actors, STC, Houthis, whoever? There are so many now.
On the one hand, it always presents an opportunity to blame it on these kinds of crises always present an opportunity to blame it on a political adversary. But then at the same time, so you could see, the Houthis blaming this on what they call the siege on Yemen. You could see the STC using this as a way of pointing the finger at their adversaries in the government. But at the same time, the Houthis are effectively engaging in governance. So it puts them at a risk of creating too much of an issue of it, in the sense that, they're the ones who would directly have the finger pointed at them in terms of quality of life issues. And then obviously the STC is now, after the Riyadh agreement, participating with the internationally recognized government as part of one government. So there's also limits in terms of how much of an opposition party they can act as while they're still part of the government, if that makes sense. I do think, at least in terms of targeting particular figures, there's potentially an opportunity there. But I would say that by and large, to the extent of different Yemeni factions participating in political wrangling, it's mostly a matter of divides that are already there. This is potentially exacerbating, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Then I'm just looking at the question list. Some of them I think have already been answered, and if you're looking at them as well, could be. Yeah, I think, and if any of the audience thinks that the question hasn't been answered, just type it again. And one was asking, can we guess the future of the globe? I don't think we can, so that's a short answer. But anyway, if we have only a couple of minutes, if you have any final remarks, Professor Mark and Adam and Ayal, if you have anything else to add.
I think it was Ayal who mentioned what are the prospects for conflict resolution, and I think for outside countries, conflict resolution, it's a combination on ability to persuade and ability to coerce cooperation. And I think that Russia does not have this possibility in Yemen, and I don't think the Iranians are really interested. In other words, just by their very nature of being a Shia power, I think that much of Yemen's Sunni population is not real enthusiastic about them. I think that the only actors that really have the means as well as the motivation are the GCC as a whole, but really, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and more Saudi Arabia, it seems to me, and that Saudi Arabia has had a lot of experience in the past that Yemeni actors, they're constantly at war, but there have been occasions in which they have come together and worked out conflict resolution agreements. And essentially, they have to reach the point, of what Professor Bill Zartman at Johns Hopkins calls a herding stalemate, where, like Adam said, if they all think they can win the war, then they're not going to engage in resolution. They have to be willing to understand that they're not going to win the war, and that there has to be some kind of compromise. And I would think it's a compromise involving all the internal Yemeni parties are going to have to somehow be involved in this, kind of like at the end of the North Yemeni civil war. And once again, I really think that Saudi Arabia has a better prospect of helping bringing this about than any other actor.
Adam, any final thoughts?
Not really. I mean, the one question, just one more question to respond to. There's a question about the protests that I mentioned potentially coming up in Yemen and a comparison to them with the Arab Spring. Once again, I don't want to sound extremely pessimistic, but the Arab Spring was at least in Yemen, was very much, I mean, it was political wrangling, but at least the more photogenic aspects of it were very much a middle class, upper middle class, educated movement. What I'm talking about when I say demonstrations are basically more of a explosion of public anger from a much more impoverished demographic. You've seen some sort of things like that happening in urban areas, particularly in Aden at some point last summer. To some extent, I think the possibility of having sort of those sorts of, at least Arab Spring, if you're remembering it from the more photogenic aspects, that kind of mass movement. Let's not forget that Yemen has experienced such a tremendous brain drain, a loss of its middle class, a loss of its more educated classes. So, I mean, youth, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's key to remember that we're talking about a country that's changed quite rapidly or quite drastically since 2011. So yeah, when I'm saying demonstrations, we're talking angry people burning tires, blocking roads, et cetera. But it's hard to imagine something more organized manifesting itself, at least barring some sort of dramatic changes. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. Ayal, do you have any final thought or remark?
No, this has been really a rich discussion. Thank you so much.
Yeah, really, thank you so much. I think, it's sad to say that, Yemen is the periphery in terms of international attention. It's a center maybe definitely in the region, but I think, it's tragic, and the human cost of that is especially for the average Yemeni is extremely saddening. But I think we've had a very interesting discussion. We highlighted enough points around the issue, and maybe highlighting what the lack of impact, as much as speaking about where the impact points will exist, which I think is quite relevant. And one could build on them to sort of either observe, follow up, and then see how things go. And hopefully this conflict in Ukraine ends soon, and also in Yemen and in other areas where people are suffering needlessly. Thank you so much, Professor Mark. Thank you so much, Adam, for your time. Thank you, Ayael, also. And thank you for everybody who was listening patiently. And apologies if some of the questions were missed or if the answers weren't comprehensive or adequate enough. And till next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.